Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Manzone, and I will be exploring how action costs may bias perceptual decision-making processes. Here, perceptual decision-making means making a perceptual judgment about incoming sensory information. For example, imagine you're apple picking and you can only fit one more apple into your basket. To make your choice, you will perform a perceptual judgment to determine which apple has the brightest red skin. Since you will enact the perceptual decision by performing an action, you may also consider the cost associated with making a particular decision. For example, if one apple is easy to reach, while another apple requires a very effortful movement to obtain, does the harder to reach apple appear less bright or less red? In the lab, we assess perceptual decision-making by presenting random dot motion stimuli and asking participants to determine if there's coherent motion in the left or rightward direction. To manipulate task difficulty, we change the amount of dots moving in random directions and the amount of dots moving either leftward or rightward. Thus, the task is relatively difficult when the motion coherence is near 0, and relatively easy when the motion coherence is near 50% and beyond. To understand how motor costs influence perceptual decision-making, Hagura et al. Had participants enact their decisions by performing reaching movements and manipulated the force required to enact each decision. Critically, the force required to make a leftward decision was increased gradually during an induction period, such that participants were not aware that one response was associated with a higher action cost. The results indicated that relative to a baseline period, less rightward coherence was needed to make a rightward decision when the leftward decision had a high action cost. That is, there was a perceptual bias away from the costlier decision. It's important to note that the manipulation to motor cost in the previous experiment was implicit rather than explicit. That is, participants were unaware that one decision was associated with a higher cost. However, for many daily activities like choosing an apple based on color at an orchard or grocery store, we explicitly know that some decisions will have a higher action cost than others. Thus, to more fully understand the interactions between the decision-making and action systems, it's important to explore how explicit action costs influence our perceptual decisions. So, in the present experiment, participants were presented with random dot motion stimuli and made a leftward movement if they thought there was coherent leftward motion, and a rightward movement if they thought there was coherent rightward motion. To increase the motor cost associated with each action, I attached a resistance band to each participant's wrist and anchored it on either the left or the right side of a table. Thus, in the tension right condition, reaching to the right stretched the band and therefore more force was required to enact the rightward decision, and in the tension left condition, reaching left stretched the band, and therefore more force was required to enact the leftward decision. To make these costs explicit, participants were able to see the band and were told about the action cost differences. Further, the tension condition was unchanged throughout an experimental session. So if participants integrate explicit and implicit motor costs into their decisions in a similar way, then participants will be biased away from the costly decision. That is, more rightward coherence will be needed to make a rightward decision when the right response has a high cost. However, since the costs are explicit and unchanging, participants may strategically pre-plan the costly response to overcome any reaction time or movement time differences between responses. Here, pre-planning one response may prime the visual system such that if a right response was pre-planned, the visual system may be primed to see rightward motion. This will lead to a bias towards the costlier decision, as less rightward coherence will be needed to make a rightward decision when the right response has a high cost. Here I present the decision-making data from all participants and the associated psychometric curves fitted to the data. So on the y-axis is the percentage of responses participants made a rightward decision, and on the x-axis is the motion coherence of the stimuli. The vertical lines represent the perceptual thresholds and quantify the amount of coherence needed to make a rightward decision. From this, we can see that in many participants, there is a clear shift in the psychometric curve and perceptual threshold between conditions. Here I present the mean perceptual thresholds across all participants, separately for the tension left and tension right condition. I also present the data from each individual participant as these gray lines. From this figure, we can see that the threshold to make a rightward judgment was significantly lower in the tension right compared to the tension left condition, and the direction of this effect was consistent across most participants. This provides evidence that when the right response was associated with a higher motor cost, relatively less rightward sensory evidence was needed to make a rightward decision. Further, the overall percentage of rightward responses across all trials was significantly greater when a right response had a higher cost compared to when the left response had a higher cost. Overall, the results are suggestive of a bias towards, rather than away from, the decision associated with higher motor cost. I hypothesized that since the cost differences were explicit and unchanging within an experimental session, that participants may have strategically pre-planned the costly response to overcome the potential reaction time and movement time differences between responses. This may have led to motor visual priming. So, for example, when a rightward response is planned, it may have activated the cognitive representations of right in the brain. This may have primed the visual system to see rightward motion. Another example of this is seen in Wolfschlager in 2000, in which participants were presented stimuli that could rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. The authors found that when the participants were preparing to do a clockwise movement, they were more likely to report a clockwise visual motion, and vice versa. So, overall, this experiment may provide initial evidence that implicit and explicit action costs may be incorporated into decision-making via distinct mechanisms.